So welcome along, everyone. I think we are now live on the first Plus Social Good and UNHCR joint webinar on the use of technology and innovation in humanitarian response. It's an honor to be moderating this session. I'm Laura Walker-McDonald. I'm the CEO of SimLab, Social Impact Lab, and we are a small group of crazy people who spend a lot of time thinking about how to use very accessible, very low-end technology to do really complicated things in environments that aren't always ideal. So this is a real treat for me. It's also wonderful to be joined by friends who I've worked with in many cases for a number of years. And I'll come to them in a second. First of all, just to tell you that we will be monitoring Twitter during the event, and afterwards the conversation will continue. And the hashtag is #InnoVForGood, with the 4 being a number. And if you have questions for our speakers, then do post them on Twitter, and we will address them in about sort of half an hour or so. Hopefully we can have a good discussion. But so first of all, just to open with a few thoughts from us. So one of our most high-profile projects has been Frontline SMS, which Sean is going to talk a little bit about shortly. But one of the things that we work on is using these low-end technologies to really increase the impact and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of responders. And it's been sort of an interesting journey for me over the last 5 years. We've seen lots of use of technology in humanitarian aid, almost always by and for international responders. And most of the documentation and the writing and the thinking that goes on around that has been around the higher tech stuff. So let's talk about big data, let's look at drones, and there's a lot of excitement about that. But I think it's really important to also recognize the power of low-end technology, so mobile, voice and SMS, radio, even notice boards, and in the recent Ebola crisis, we've seen that some of the best ways to get messages out is still using people, so public criers and human networks. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to welcome our panelists. The first who's going to speak to us a little bit about his experiences is Ben Rudolph, who until recently was with UNHCR Innovation and is now a software engineer at Dimagi. He's very kindly taken time out to speak to us. He's currently helping to develop mobile health software that provides community health workers with an easy-to-use data collection system. He was previously, as I said, at UNHCR Innovation, helping to bring innovative technological solutions to refugee settings. And during his time at UNHCR, he assisted in the setup of 2 SMS pilots, which he's documented in a very nice website, which the link is, I think, has been shared through the Hangout, but he's going to tell us about those 2 pilots. So Ben, why don't you take it away and tell us a bit about what you're working on?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. So first, I guess I'll start with how I got involved in SMS and using response in refugee settings. Ascend was basically an idea born out of collaboration from UNHCR Innovation and Stanford University. It was an experiment to try and get students involved in creating ideas around solving some of the most difficult problems. Our class was tasked with coming up with ideas on how to help with early camp registration. We worked on this problem for 10 weeks, coming up with all sorts of ideas and solutions. We ended up going to the field in Ethiopia to visit 2 refugee camps, Sherkoli and Bambasi, on the Sudanese border. And I really like how you brought up that a lot of the talking is about these high-tech solutions. One of the first things we noticed when we went there is that really a lot of this stuff wasn't feasible, whether just the context or other factors made it very difficult to implement very high-tech solutions. And we decided that actually SMS could be an easy way to gain access to refugees and open up a dialogue between staff and refugees more easily, and something that wasn't being used in all of refugee camps or even cities. We worked on the project for a few more months throughout the summer, getting constant feedback and guidance from UNHCR, and eventually we took the project to UNHCR, and with them we helped pilot in Esmeraldas, Ecuador, and San Jose, Costa Rica. Both pilots ended up being successful. I'm going to talk and focus a little bit more about San Jose, Costa Rica, because we did a better job collecting data and getting more information on it, so I can talk and speak a little bit more about the facts and the successes in a more concrete manner. The San Jose, Costa Rica pilot started this past summer in April, and it initiated from the field, which is one of the first things that we learned working at UNHCR, was that, you know, if we're going to implement new technology and new tech, a lot of times it's best to have that interest come from the people who are actually going to be use it, instead of coming from top down. So initially that was a really good sign, and kind of paved the way for success in San Jose. We did like a series of 3 months of preparing people, getting contacts ready, and getting mobile numbers ready. One of the more difficult things was consolidating all the numbers. A lot of the organizations there had scattered databases of Excel sheets, et cetera, et cetera. So working with them to put all that together became a task in and of itself. Eventually in April, we went down for 2 weeks to set up SMS and decide on how the system was going to be used within the city. And as soon as we went down, the first thing we did was interview refugees and talk to focus groups, because we wanted to figure out the best way that SMS could work in their lives. And some of the major findings I found is jobs are a big one. Like, people want to know about jobs, people want to know about their rights as refugees. Something that wasn't communicated as easily, because in order to get information, they would have to go to the office, the actual office. So this is something we immediately noticed, wrote down, and decided to act on. The next part was actually setting up the technology, and this is when we decided to use, well, we decided a little while ago before, to use Frontline SMS. And this is actually probably the easier part, is just choosing the technology and using the technology. We went through a set of trainings, and one thing I couldn't stress enough was just building capacity to use the system. You can easily have someone come in, implement all the technology, and just do the technology, but if the people on the ground don't know how to use the system, it'll never be picked up, it'll never be used. So we pushed really hard so that we weren't, or UNHCR wasn't the ones using the system. It was the NGOs and the staff on the ground that actually learned how to use Frontline SMS and learned how to conduct polls and interviews, or broadcast messages. So once we got the trainings headed off, we sent a few test messages and got some results back immediately. And in the following 3 months, we did monitoring evaluation, kept track of a variety of different indicators. They're all listed in the report, and you can look at the numbers if you're so interested. But after the 3 months, we did like kind of a retrospective and went back and took a look at what we learned from the pilot and what kind of information we could help if anyone else was interested in running an SMS pilot or just implementing SMS in general. So I'll go through a couple of the big lessons that we learned, so you can hopefully... First one was technical issues. I think no matter what software platform you choose, there's always going to be bugs and crashes and stuff like that. So testing this beforehand is huge. If you're working in international context, it's really easy to test it only in English. If it's really important to test special characters, etc., so that when you actually start testing with accents and stuff like that, it works. Scalability. Often when testing, you're using just a couple people. You wanna really make sure that when you go to pilot and you're using hundreds of contacts, that the system will hold up. And another thing you want to simulate is low connectivity, especially in areas where you have really spotty internet. Things won't work as expected. Like a lot of things depend on syncing, and when the internet cuts in and out, you have to make sure that it still works. Another big thing we learned was trust building. When we first sent out the greeting message, the most common response we got was, "Who is this?" Basically, no one knew or trusted the messages we were sending. And so a big lesson learned is, put some campaign behind the SMS pilot that you're doing. We created posters, put them up over the NGOs we were working with, and even in the waiting room, so people became familiar with the number that was being used and what the purpose was. Every time a new refugee registered or asylum seeker registered with NGO, there was a briefing about SMS alerts and messages so that they could grow to expect them. And then lastly, we set up a system of where people could put in forms with their name and number, and they would be entered into the database, so then they would be expecting to receive messages. Another big one was invalid numbers. So I talked a little bit about how before we started the pilot, we tried to collect everyone's phone numbers, and this was kind of a haphazard process, and it ended up being that around 40% of the contacts that we had were invalid numbers for a variety of reasons, whether it was like mistyped, out of use. People switch numbers quite often. So this was a big issue, and I think one thing that we did to try and like solve this is when they do register, write down their phone number immediately and talk to asylum seekers about updating their phone numbers with the NGO or UNHCR when they change numbers. But a big part about that is making sure that people find use in the SMS. So if they don't find any value in the SMS that you're sending to them, they're not going to tell you when they're changing their number. So we try to really stress that not to send spam out using these systems, and spam doesn't have to be the traditional sense of spam, but just information that isn't for your targeted group of people. We tried to use grouping of the contacts to try and specify and target our messages as best as possible, so we weren't sending out computer class trainings times to people that weren't interested in learning about computers. Another way to increase kind of engagement with UNHCR and these NGOs was putting out consistent programming. So every week we sent out a broadcast message telling people about their rights and different little facts about living in Costa Rica. And lastly, when the pilot moves into kind of integrating into the organization, it's not always as like simple as use this technology. A system kind of has to be set up in place, the kind of human system. So we put together like some usage guidelines for how SMS could be used within an organization, and this will be different, I think, for lots of different NGOs. For us, it involved one person that was in charge of the day-to-day messaging, so who's going to respond to those messages that are sent every day, because we want to make sure that each response is being taken care of. Who's going to be responsible for the larger messages, so the polls and the broadcasts, and that was another person. And then lastly, we had a third person who was in charge of kind of overseeing and fact-checking the larger messages that were sent, like as broadcasts, making sure that the facts that were sent were accurate. And so that plan worked well in all of the NGOs that we set up in, but I think even just thinking about and really putting together a plan of how this will be integrated into the organization is huge, because without it, you'll end up going back to your old way of working, and the technology will have a much harder time gaining hold and actually becoming embedded in the organization instead of just becoming another one-off pilot. So that was my kind of experience and lessons learned from Costa Rica and piloting there. Many questions or anything like that?
Thanks so much, Ben. That was great. I think we've got our Twitter handle is Innovating For Good, with the number 4 in the middle. And if anyone has any questions, please do post them on the hashtag, and we'll respond to them. I have a ton, but I think it might be good to hear from all of our speakers, and we can just have a conversation about some of the issues raised. There are definitely lots of really important lessons learned, and if you look in the Showcase app, you'll see the link to Ben's case study at ascend.unhcrinnovation.org. And I really recommend it. It's an excellent case study and very useful. And particularly, I think, for me, in that very often these kinds of case studies focus on the technological side of things, and the human stuff, as you say, Ben, is just so critical. So I'll without further ado, I'll ask Mike to step to the mic. And Mike is the International Coordinator of First Response Radio, and I've been working with Mike, I think now for several years, through the CDAC work, the Communicating with Disaster Affected Communities work. Mike's originally from Seattle and Washington, and actually you started as an aircraft radio technician. I think there's a separate webcast we done about how we all got to here.
Yes.
But so I think we all have interesting stories. Mike worked as a broadcast engineer and has received the Society of Broadcast Engineers certification for 20 years of work in radio. And after the 2004 tsunami, I think, started to work with local partners in Indonesia to put an emergency FM radio station on the air, and then started to think about this and developed a rapid response radio unit, right, which you've now implemented in Bihar in India in 2008, in Sumatra in Indonesia following the earthquake there in September 2009, and then most recently you've deployed to Tacloban in the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan. And you were there on the 5th day and were broadcasting a day later, which is pretty impressive. So, Mike, I'd love to invite you to tell us a little bit about, because you use radio, but also I think you use SMS as well. So we'd love to hear a little bit about both technologies and how all of that works.
Okay. I think I share a lot of the same thoughts with Ben about, why are we using simple technology? At some point in my career as an engineer, I was the new technology guy. And as I started working with partners all around Asia and the developing world, I realized that people just needed really good help on making simple traditional technologies work. And what I saw in the disaster zones from the tsunami in 2004, when all radio and TV stations were off the air for about 2 weeks after the tsunami, and just really there's no connectivity. The places that we've been, there is no internet. Everything on the phone network goes down. If the phone comes back up, it's voice and SMS only for a while. I think in Tacloban, about 2 weeks, we were getting voice calls. Texting was working, more robust, solid technology, but it was a couple weeks before they got internet back onto our phones. So people were saying, gee, I can't Facebook, and a number of things like that. So we've seen that good old-fashioned FM radio is reliable, and I'll explain how we use it, and this texting technology gets through when other things don't. And so those are reasons that we've decided we wanted to use those technologies. Bridge, as my backup technician, can I ask you to plug in the power cord there? I just see the lights flashing for my battery. Sorry, got all this technology, and we're trying to stay on the air. Or you can pull one of these other ones on the side there. Sorry. So we really do think that simple technology is important. So we're doing. Oh yeah. Any one of those will do. That's fine. So we do radio in a suitcase. The first response radio is our goal to get a radio station on the air within 72 hours of disaster anywhere in the world, and we work with different partners to do that. And so our formula is really simple. Choose disaster-prone countries, equip them, train them, and then the local team responds to disasters. Because we're doing radio, it all has to be in the local language. We need local partners. Can't do this on our own. And so the equipping part is we're equipping them with this radio in a suitcase. So behind me, I've got this Samsonite suitcase, and I will just tip you up a little bit there to have a little look inside. Or a Samsonite suitcase. I carried it on the airplane with me. It's got a laptop and a mixer and a digital recorder and a bunch of stuff in there and a bunch of headsets. So that's our studio, transmitter in a suitcase, antenna, and a piano keyboard bag. It all packs up and goes on the airplane with us. We equip a team with that. We train them for 5 days. We take them into the field. We do an exercise, and a 3-day field exercise. It's really like what Ben is saying. Can't just test it in the office. You got to get out into the fields. You got to get dirty with this stuff before the big disaster comes. And that's why things really worked well, I think, when Typhoon Haiyan came along. And so those are really our key distinctives, and it's more important to equip and train than how high-tech the technology is. Even using some of these simple, inclusive technologies, the training and the empowering, the equipping of the local partner is the really powerful thing, actually. So because of this procedure of ours, we had kit in the Philippines already. I happened to be there as the typhoon blew through. We had people who had been trained, and we had this kind of response philosophy. So that's how we ended up on the ground on day 5. We were on the roof of the partially destroyed City Hall. The morning of day 6, we put the antenna up on a little bamboo pole and raised it up on the top of City Hall and started broadcasting to the affected community. Later, I asked the representative from UNFPA, I asked Alex why she thought we were so successful, why she thought we had really connected with the community and the community valued our station. And she said, because you were there from the very early days and you informed, but you also, like, you know, entertained, brought hope, became a friend of the community, and just a number of things that radio delivered. Informing the water and sanitation. So we connected with the WASH cluster group, got into the cluster groups, got key messages, got them translated into Tagalog or Waray, got them put into community service announcements and broadcast out. So core messages from humanitarian groups put into radio and out to the people. But in the evenings, they would, it wasn't always just inform. In the evenings, they would switch to music programs, requests, chat, talk. People really did want to return to normal. They really did want to smile again. They did want to have fun, and someone, this radio station that was there to be their friends, connect with them, and bring normal and bring hope back was important to them. The last story is the UNFPA group, this women's group, were doing special medical clinics for women who had young babies, pregnant women, or mothers of young children. And they had special medical needs in this time, and they had a clinic that was reaching out just to them. And it was really undersubscribed. They knew roughly the population of the area. They knew how many to expect, and they were getting just a fraction of the women they were trying to serve were showing up. They came and broadcast a informative program on First Response Radio on the top floor of City Hall, and spent some time telling everybody what this clinic was about, where it was, when it was, and the next day the numbers went way up. They like doubled and tripled. They hit like all-time records of women attending their clinics, achieving like 90% of their target audience, and they said it just clearly made a difference that these humanitarian partners working with the radio partner really did connect with the people that they were trying to serve, and they were clearly informed about these services and were taking advantage of them. In our, we like to use Frontline SMS technology as well. I was just noticing that that we use the same technology, we use it differently than Ben's group. We don't have a list of phone numbers before. We don't know who is out there. We start broadcasting on the radio station. That's us reaching out to them. We give out our phone number, and they text into us, and we gather all this information through the Frontline SMS texting. We may do surveys. To begin with, it's what do you need? What are your information needs? How can we help you? Text us in and tell us now what it is, what kind of information you need us to help you get. And sometimes cluster groups had specific questions, like going back to school. Children weren't showing up in school. There's a big campaign, get back into school by the end of this week, or you won't be registered. You'll miss a whole year of school. And a lot of kids weren't showing up. And so we put it out on the radio. Text us and tell us what you think the main reason is why children aren't back into school. And we got quite a few suggestions. You know, some of them, they were just afraid of the weather. It was still kind of cloudy and rainy, and they didn't want to be back in school when another storm blew through. And they identified a few of these key issues through us reaching out to them and them texting back. And so it turned radio into a two-way communication. It wasn't just us delivering information to the community, it was listening to them talking to us informing them. It really created that two-way interaction. And so I think those are the key things that that happened in Typhoon High, and we really saw that it was equip, train, and respond. That's what really helped us get out the door quickly, and working with the whole humanitarian community meant we could get reliable messaging out there, and it clearly made an impact to some of these groups like UNFPA, who said that their numbers doubled and tripled as soon as they had started programming over our radio station. And our Filipino colleagues were 6 weeks on the air before they closed down and transitioned out, and they did a really great job. It's become what one UN coordinator said. This is the story that people talk about until the next big disaster, and I think it did really have an impact.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for that. Another really interesting example, and quite different both in context and speed of deployment, and the amount of time you had to think. I remember being on Skype with you trying to troubleshoot things while you were in airports and things like that, which is always the more rock and roll bit of humanitarian response. But lots of time, I know, very slow and steady time working with partners to get things up and running with them, and to keep it going. Are they still? They were up for 6 weeks. But do you think that they, if another big disaster happens, they're all ready to go, and there's a sustainable network there now that can?
Yes, that's the other side of the story that I didn't say, is that we got them out the door and got them on the air running for 6 weeks. Radio Abante filled the gap after that. I equipped another team that were local journalists, and they continued on up until very recently, even. And then we took all this equipment and we did another training last June. We trained 15 more responders in June, tied a bunch of other agencies together. And so now there were 2 sets of equipment, 15 trained responders, a key leader appointed, and they're all linked on Facebook. So when Typhoon Ruby blew through last month in December, the team was ready to roll. They had 2 sets of equipment. They were spoiled for choice. They did some coordination with a few agencies, and those who started practicing together and working together in Haiyan then responded in Typhoon Ruby this year. So certainly the working, that partnership, it really made a difference just last month in the Ruby response.
That's great news, and good to hear. So I want to bring in our third speaker, who I've asked to be a bit of a discussant and respond and just sort of give some thoughts to what we've heard from Ben and Mike. So Sean is the CEO of Frontline SMS, which so until recently was part of the SynLab group and is now an independent company since December, but has already been named to the Nominate Trust Social 100, even in that short time. Frontline Tools, it's been around for almost 10 years and has been downloaded more than 225 times in 199 territories, and is being used by thousands of organizations to reach tens of millions of people with social impact programming. Sean is a trustee of the Awesome Foundation in Washington, D.C. in the US, and is an affiliate with the Harvard University's Berkman Center. He's an advisor to Digital Democracy, DoSomething.org, ECPAT USA, the Law Without Walls program, Tech Change, and UNDP. And originally comes from a law background, which we'll reserve for that other webinar we're going to have sometime. Obviously lots going on with you, Sean, but it'd be great to hear a little bit about how Frontline, what are Frontline's plans, what's going on right now, what can we expect to see, and just as a platform provider, I remember well, it's a very different perspective, and it's great to hear these stories from the field and to hear how people are using the technology. What are your thoughts on Ben and Mike's stories, and more generally on how Frontline's technology has been used for disaster response, and how you think it could be used?
Absolutely. I guess first, I just want to say how completely spoiled I feel to be on a call with Ben and Mike. I think as a platform provider, we are constantly in awe of people who are able to use our tools full stop, but also who are able to use our tools to such amazing ends. It's really why we do what we do. I think that for us, it's important to say that we've been trying to design to the lowest common infrastructure for so long, but still meet that two-way response. Because I think that one of the things that we really believe is that when you encounter a problem, with or without technology, the first thing you're trying to do is assess it, figure out or map the capacity to respond to it, and then bring those groups together to really architect a solution. And I think that whether you're talking about Mike looking for opt-in communications and the way that he was able to expand and expose the role of local service providers via radio, or whether or not you're talking about Ben, really ensuring that messages weren't spam and they were high quality and that there was a really vigorous two-way kind of quality control exchange, you're looking at programming that really prioritizes very sincerely given opt-in and really high quality kind of messaging in order to basically be worth people's time. And I think in humanitarian response, like in low-income environments, in every country across the world, we sometimes forget that people are spending their time even when they're not spending their money. And in times of disaster, every second counts, right? No one has the time to waste with spam messages. And Laura, you mentioned earlier kind of the Ebola response. And one of the things that we really found, there were over 200 deployments of SMS messaging. Big international organizations came in and blasted millions of messages through what is otherwise limited infrastructure. And that programming like that has always kind of asked the question to me, how many messages from a stranger would it take to convince you of a major disaster in your area? Right? Like how many messages, how many emails or spam messages would it take to convince you that Ebola was real? And I think that one of the things that we found, and one of our user bases in a scenario like this, was the United Methodist Church, who had this very pre-established social capital and this very clear network of users. And even within that network, even within personal relationships that had long been established, there was a major difference between messages that were personally signed by individuals within that network and messages that just came through a known number. And so, as Mike and Ben have talked about, not only in terms of capacity of the organization providing services or responding, but also in terms of the quality of the relationship with the community, it's really, really impossible to overestimate how important it is to be respectful and kind and positive and useful. And those are, from a platform perspective, those are all content issues, right? Those are not, I can't make a message great or not great, but what we can do, hopefully, is make it easier to design for things that push people to opt in, that enable people to connect with a much wider range of audiences through multiple platforms, and and engage in a more meaningful, kind of more structured way. And I think that that's another thing to really touch on. You asked, where's Frontline going? Frontline is really pushing to focus on relationships with other platforms. As soon as we're able, we're going to be building much stronger points of interface, and make it much easier to connect local SMS messaging to international broadcast platforms, to social media properties like ideally like Facebook. Fingers crossed for APIs working in both directions there. But there's a lot of helping take kind of some of the structure work, some of the balance out of it. And I think that you mentioned that Frontline has been used in over 140 countries and got more than 225,000 downloads. The things that we're focusing on and the things that we think are so important, just to add to the points that Mike and Ben have made, are one, how important it is to know what you want to achieve, right? That having very clear objectives when you're asking for other people to contribute their time, to contribute their energy, and sometimes their resources. There's just no underestimating how important it is to be able to work with work with real tangible goals and real tangible capacity to bring to those goals. And the second thing I would say is just having a very clear sense of the cost implications of your own system. And Ben touched on this, and Mike touched on this in terms of the clinic, knowing what it is that you're trying to promote, and being able to make sure that, if it took 50 messages for someone to get from knowing nothing to finding themselves at a clinic, that's a lot of time, that's a lot of cost, and that would ultimately be very expensive for the clinic. Similarly, if a broadcast had reached 1 million people and the clinic had gotten 1 million appointments, or 1 million people had shown up, wrapped around the outside waiting in line for services, a lot of programs, I think, are in some ways crushed by the need and the success of their outreach, but limited capacity to respond to it. And it's, for us, it is why building networks are so strong, are such a strong core focus. And being able to say, okay, we've reached all of the people that we're going to be able to reach with our clinical services, to say nothing of our technological services or information services. How do we make sure that the people who need our services are able to find the closest second clinic that may be able to find them? And so, I guess the last thing I'll say, just because I think Mike and Ben's observations are going to be so much more important, is one of my favorite quotes to think about, or one of my favorite quotes in kind of planning technology interventions actually comes from Abraham Lincoln. And it's just, if you have 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'm going to spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. And I think, in these responses, so much of that is about building strong, resilient networks through preparedness, through experience, through really distributed tools and really distributed kind of sharing and collaboration models. And that's something that I think Ben and Mike both do, or have done beautifully, and one of the reasons that we're so excited to be a small support to them.
Thank you very much, Sean. Really interesting reflections, and I can see a lot of discussion and a lot of reflection of our conversation coming up on the Innovating For Good hashtag. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Mike, Ben, and Sean, then please post them on the hashtag Innovating For Good, with the 4 being a number 4, and we'll be delighted to take them. But I'm going to abuse my position as moderator and get in a few of my own first, because I can. And so, actually, I remember reading, Ben, in your case study, and I'll pad this out so you have time to find the mute button, because that's always an issue, which I just had. So, in your case study, you said that while you'd started with broadcast messaging to lots of people once you had your database sorted out, after a time you shifted to small group messaging and messaging with individuals, and also noted that you started sending like a weekly text with just some information that was relevant in it, so that people were used to hearing from you. That's actually something that I had started to advise people to do recently as well, and I was struck by reading it in your case study, rereading that yesterday, that that's probably where I stole the idea from. But I think you mentioned, Sean's also mentioned, that building trust and people are really understanding that this SMS service is useful and helpful is so important. And I just wanted to see if you could reflect a little bit on the sort of how you got to the point where you thought, okay, we need to do smaller group messaging, and how you used it, how that was different from the broadcast messaging.
That's a good point. And I think a lot of these insights came, I failed to mention this, but in the 3 months of follow-up after the initial pilot, we also did some interviews, and interviews from people getting messages from the NGO Akai that we were working with on the ground. And I just want to make the distinction that a lot of those small group messaging was happening with Akai. They were working more directly with the beneficiaries, but their programs were geared towards smaller groups in general. So they had lots of trainings, lots of workshops about building capacity and stuff like that. So inherently, their kind of organization was geared towards working with these smaller groups of people to help build English skills. And so we realized like very quickly that people weren't really responding as well to the mass broadcast messages, because really what they were trying to do was target just a small group of people. Whereas the weekly messaging program worked really well with UNHCR, and UNHCR in San Jose kind of takes more of a managerial role, where it kind of manages a lot of the NGOs on the ground, but asylum seekers won't repeatedly go back to UNHCR. So actually, as the source of kind of rights and duties, UNHCR was the kind of the place. So for them, broadcasting out to their entire contact database worked really well, because they had a few things they needed to update to their audience and communities. And I think like this really just kind of spoke to really tailoring your messages to what kind of organization you're working with. So I think if you're an organization that works in small groups and really kind of targets these smaller portions, then you should probably target your messaging in the same way. Just like UNHCR was more of a kind of manager position, where it kind of used information to help refugees learn about their rights in the area. Does that answer your question?
I believe it addresses it beautifully, yes. But I wanted to have this bit be a little bit more of a discussion, so I would encourage Mike and Sean to chip in if you have thoughts also. And I'm watching the mute buttons and they're still on. So another question, go for it, Sean.
Sorry, I just to echo Ben's point, I think that's particularly when you look in distance from urban centers, most services, whether in times of crisis or times of persistent crisis, or just in areas where infrastructure isn't always built, you have really similar models of service extension and service distribution. And I think working to, recognizing that you have lots of complementary distributed capacity and mapping your communications infrastructure to that capacity is a really great way to start building effective service networks and effective response networks. And then, when things really do need additional resources or really do need specialist treatment, then it's able to escalate kind of more up a hierarchy or up a food chain. And then each of that bit of distributed capacity becomes not only sensory network and response, but it also is able to start operating within a much more effective back end, where it's able to direct the attention of international actors and national actors and private sector actors. And I think that's, to me, in a lot of ways, that's kind of the ideal of the system architecture that we're moving toward.
Thanks, Mike. Anything you want to comment on that?
This reminds me of one of the comments about we were using the texting for feedback, from the community in Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And we were there as part of a communicating with communities strategy. It was important that there was two-way communication going on. We were informing, but we were listening to the community as well. And the whole working group, which met every couple of weeks and looked at feedback coming from the community, they said that the information that the radio station got back, the response to the radio station through texting and through phone-in, it was the most useful, actionable feedback to them, because it came from a broad sector. It wasn't like an NGO had just done a delivery or a project in a certain village for a certain thing, and they asked people for feedback. When the radio goes out, it goes out to the whole community, across the whole disaster zone, people in all sectors. And when we said, how are things going for you? What do you need? Or when we asked a question, the feedback came back from a real good, broad cross-section of society. And the Communicating with Communities working group said it was some of the most clear kind of actionable feedback. And I haven't really seen or heard that before. So that was really good for us to see that we were creating that two-way mechanism, and it was really useful to the humanitarian community to hear what the community was saying.
Yeah, I think so, and I think we are starting to see more of these feedback mechanisms using SMS and radio, but also there is an interesting project that we're working on with World Vision and Intrac in the UK, funded by DFID, looking at feedback mechanisms, including, and the most popular thing that has been used far beyond, I think, expectations is feedback boxes. Even if women had to get together to write the messages down with somebody who could write, and then they would all go together and put the feedback in. It was just very empowering, I think, and we found this with projects in Kenya with ActionAid, where the community found it just changed the power balance, the relationship, to be able to feedback, to be able to ask for things, to be able to, in one case, actually redirect a food distribution because the community had moved. But I think that, to me, does also beg the question about a really quite serious one, about the level to which the major donors and large agencies are able and willing to respond quickly to community feedback when it's very radical in its content. So, for example, if a community asks for something completely different than what's being provided, and an agency thinks, well, that's not within my mandate. So saying we'd rather have shelter support than food aid, when perhaps that's not something that that particular agency is up for doing. And I think that's probably going to continue to be a feature of these discussions as this increasing emphasis on community-facing accountability increases. We've got about 15 minutes left. We do have a question on Twitter, which I'm going to drop among the pigeons shortly. But before I do, I just wanted to return to one other thing that came up for me in our discussion, which was, Mike, you mentioned that the high-on response supported for your radio partners an improved response for the subsequent Hurricane Ruby. And one of the things that I get quite, and I'm increasingly critical of, is that many of these technologies we know you can't deploy in an emergency. If you're deploying a new technology in an emergency, it's too late. You needed to be there beforehand. And I wondered, Mike, in particular, whether you could reflect on, and you and I have talked about this before, the need to get out to risk-prone countries before something happens and invest funds and time in building capacity and building these communications ecosystems and ability ahead of time. What do you see as being the barriers? Why are we not doing a better job of doing that, do you think?
That's a great question, and it is my absolute key passion that we're out there building capacity in countries that are disaster prone, and it works so well for us. Or people have spotted the trend. Mike goes and does a training event somewhere, and then the disaster follows soon afterwards, or even in some cases right in the middle of the training class, the disaster strikes. And we're just using the UN risk list, some great UN risk assessment lists that look at natural disaster or man-made conflict as well, which gives kind of hazard scoring to different countries. And then we look to see if we've got partners there. We start equipping and training. And I really fell into the other camp to begin with, where I thought that we were going to do this like international rescue, and the team was going to fly in, and we're going to do a response, so we're going to fly back out. And to begin with, we bought one kit. And we sat in Singapore, and we were going to respond to the world from Singapore. And right away, I realized that our strategy was all wrong. It couldn't work like that, that we need local teams. Local teams need to speak the local language. They need to be connected. All these partners, we need World Vision Philippines with First Response Radio Philippines and FEBC Philippines, and all these agencies who locally are there on the ground connected. That's where the power of the network comes. And really, the magic of what we do is not the equipping. It's not in the training in the class. It's the 3 days that everyone spends in the field exercise. That is where the magic happens. Because these people, they've left the air-conditioned, comfortable classroom, and they've got out into the field, and they sweat together, and they live in tents, or we put them up on army cots or whatever. And they spend 3 days really flogging it out in the field. And they build a team. There's a relationship. They are going to they will respond. You call them, they're going to be there. And this is the power that we found. It's this building this network, empowering and training, and leaving the equipment there. And then when I walk away, we've got a local team. They don't need to call Mike. They just respond, and they start getting on with it. And I've seen that work so well that I really resist this knee-jerk almost reaction to, let's fly a team in and fix something where we don't have anybody there. We've tried it. It's really, really hard. I far prefer to be building capacity before. And why is it more popular? I really don't know, because it's working awesomely great for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think and none of us on this call can actually fix this problem, but it's to do with, I think it's funding. I think it comes down to money. There's much more money available when a big thing happens, preferably a storm or an earthquake, and not just floods. Then there's more money for innovation, and so I think that we've seen technological leaps forward in the responses to the Haitian earthquake, but before that, the Asian tsunami in 2004, and then again with Haiyan. There's just more funds available and there's more pressure to try innovative things to get the job done. But I do really believe that it's such a critical issue for our sector. So we do have a question from Twitter, and I'm gonna drop it in, and do please respond to the issue about disaster preparedness if you'd like to. But I'm gonna ask Sean in particular to respond to a question that we've had, which is, when do we start rolling out solutions for smartphones? The reducing cost of the smartphone removes the financial barrier to using it. It's true that phone, I think the first sub-$60 smartphone launched in South Africa, I think just beginning of last year. We're going to see continuing drops in prices, and also mobile data connectivity is improving in many countries. So Sean, what do you say to that?
I think that there are a couple of different questions at play. I think the first one is, and fundamentally, is about distribution and infrastructure. And of course, it's really, really exciting to see the rollout of smartphones. And I think one of the things that happens a lot in conversations like this are people say, why are you doing approach A and not approach B, right? And I don't know if Mike's encountered this, but why are you using SMS and not radio, or radio and not SMS? And I think that, like Mike's example would show us, I think we get the best results when we use platforms together for their strengths. And so, I think if you're operating in an environment where there are good answers and good penetration of smartphones, and a lot of people who have, a deep understanding of and ability to deploy them, by all means, let's start doing it now. I don't think anyone is. I think that everyone who cares deeply about the quality of the response and the people involved want everyone to be able to use all of the tools at their disposal to maximize the impact and the coordination that they're able to achieve. And I think that the trick is building systems that are inclusive of multiple types of inputs, of multiple platforms that build to a common strength and not to a common chaos. So now where it makes sense, and then just the quick kind of last note to that, though, is that mobile networks are a finite resource, and that they do often go down in the immediate aftermath, right? And so when you're talking about time, when you're talking about cost, it's not just cost to buy the device. It's cost, it's your data contract. It's the fact that you know how to use it, that you've pre-installed whatever application would be useful to you during the response, that you know how to use that application, that you have a profile set up on it. And these aren't meant to be dissuasive. My sincere hope is that people will set up disaster engagement and preparedness and response apps in advance of disaster right now, and there are some really good examples out there. But I think the biggest thing the biggest thing to touch on is that it's not an if this then not that kind of environment, that we need to be building multi-channel responses.
Yeah, I completely agree. Ben, Mike has something to say.
Yeah, I'd like to see us using all of these technologies together. We're distributing radios. If people don't have radios, we'll do stockpiles of thousands of radios and be getting them out into the community. And that's part of creating that full infrastructure and making the information accessible. But the thing that I wanted to add on to is what we saw was you always see these informal charging stations jumping up. People need to recharge their phones. They've got a phone. Maybe the network's up, maybe the network isn't up, but they're going to be recharging their phones. And that means one guy's got a generator, and he throws a power cord over the wall, and everyone puts in power cords to it, and they will spend, like from 5 o'clock till 10 o'clock at night, sitting there, while their phone is charging. They're not going to go away because that's their phone there. What do they do while they're sitting there? We need to hang a radio on the wall so they listen to the radio station, and take one of these teeny little Wi-Fi routers, and now hang it on the wall there. You can put, all sorts of content that people can sit there and can browse on their phones. The content being put out by this Wi-Fi router just kind of hanging there on the wall, and it's whether the full internet connectivity back to the rest of the world is working or not. It's a small, simple step that actually empowers and uses this feature of their smartphone to allow them to browse through web pages and content and things like that.
Yeah, and I think we also need to look in quite nuanced ways at who can really access some of this technology. So the example that you give, Mike, of power is really great. It's definitely a huge barrier to smartphone use. I mean, if you look at the relatively high smartphone penetration reported in Kenya, which is somewhere between 40 and 60%, and then the fact that only 19% of Kenyans have access to power in their home, you start to see the kind of, we all know smartphones last a day, and then you have to charge them up. So what does that tell you? But also, if you give the example that you've just given, if you are maybe working long hours, or you live in a very rural area and you can't afford the time or the money to travel to where there is power, and very often we find that this is going to be women who have a harder time traveling or taking time out to sit there for several hours and watch their phone charge. It's those people who are going to have the hardest time getting back online after an emergency or at all. So I think we've done a relatively terrible job of having a diverse panel today, but it's a very, very important issue with technology use, and perhaps a good one for a later webinar. Ben, did you see some of the communities you were working with using a diverse range of digital platforms, or did you see people mainly in the SMS space and that was about the most? Did you see people using smartphones at all, or?
Yeah, actually, a lot of people did have smartphones. I would say, though, a lot of them, at least in the area that I was working in, were still using your Nokia SMS phones. I think, just to speak more to that point, I think I wrote down a note when you asked that question that, mobile technology using smartphones and SMS isn't mutually exclusive. So I think Mike and Sean really kind of hit that on the head. Like, it's got to be a integrated approach. But the one thing else that I wanted to add to that is I've seen before this really desire to use smartphones, and we got to put out an app. And I think the biggest part about integrating this into your services is what is this app going to do? How is this going to help? And really thinking about what would be the most helpful for the communities that you're serving. I think it's easy to get caught up in have to use smartphones. Lots of people are using them. And just taking a step back and seeing how that can actually help the response in the best way. And as Sean was mentioning, thinking of your organization and talking about costs and what's going to help your beneficiaries the most, really just kind of utilizing kind of a cost-benefit analysis on how to best utilize smartphones in a response.
And Ben, while I've got you, we don't have much time left, but I did want to just bring out the issue of monitoring and evaluation, which you stressed also in your case study. And I know that, for us, SimLab is working on improving monitoring and evaluation of the use of technology in development and aid. And it's often missed, and I know that you were quite proud that you actually did set indicators and went and monitored them. Have you found that useful in really identifying, did the system do what we hoped for, and how would you refine what you did looking back now?
I would say definitely yes. I think the alternative is guessing. You get anecdotal reports. Maybe you'll talk to one or two people, which is valuable. But often these kind of cases are biased because maybe you interview a beneficiary. That beneficiary ends up being very in touch with the NGO, so automatically they're kind of in a different situation than the more isolated parts of the population. So you're getting a biased view. With at least some indicators and monitoring, you can make some better judgments about how your programming is doing. So if you know immediately that one survey question gets 100, 200 responses versus another one that gets 10, maybe you can start focusing your messaging towards the question that received 100 or 200 responses. And I think this is like, I mean, as hard as it is to collect this kind of information when you're on the field during response, I think it like infinitely helps improve the next time you go out and implement a system. You know better where to focus your time, energy, and money, basically.
A quick plug for watching the SimLab website for our work on that coming out this year, hopefully very soon. We've reached the end of our time. I think that the video recording of all of our, in some cases very early and in some cases very late night faces, will be up on the event page that you came to. So we'll be able to share that as well on all of our respective websites. The hashtag is #InnovForGood. I hope the conversation will continue. I'd like to thank the UNHCR team and also Plus Social Good for the opportunity to kick off their webinar series on innovation in humanitarian action. There'll be one about every month for a little while. And also to thank our speakers. Thank you, Ben, Sean, and Mike, for really, really interesting examples and a fantastic talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.